black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson. I'd like to welcome you to part two of a two-part series that I'm doing based on this book right over here. It's called, you see it up in the screen, called Birth of a White Nation. It's written by a social scientist, Jacqueline Batalora. That's her right there. And what I like about, I try to find authors who just speak truth. You know, I don't care what color them. I learned that from some great black scholars of the early 1900s, how they learned about black history. They went to European scholars, the ones who were just doing it for the scholarship, not for any racist reason, even though there was a plethora of those type of historians who just try to shape a narrative that fit the lie of white supremacy. But there are scholars who just speak the truth, and she's one of them. And she talks about in this book. Now, that's her synopsis first. Let me let you know what she's about. She is the author of the Birth of a White Nation. This book that I'm going to be talking about. This is part two of what I started in the part one. The Invention of White People and Its Relevance Today. This is the second edition, and she's an attorney and a professor of sociology and criminal justice at St. Xavier University in Chicago, and also she started as a former Chicago police officer, a brilliant scholar. And there, in the beginning of show number one, I have a little video clip of her talking at a lecture. And she goes a little bit into detail. You can find that video, I think it came out in 2014, 15, somewhere around there. And you can find it on YouTube as always. But this is where I left off. And before I start, I want to start off with this statement to emphasize why I do my show and why I talk about things that you might not have heard of or definitely were not taught in high school, okay? In the birth of whiteness. There was no such thing as whiteness. This is the point of the book. This is the point of this show. I want to quote something. It's a chilling quote. I think I've used this quote before. It goes back to 1834. It was a comment made by Henry Berry, Esquire, okay, on the floor of the Virginia House of Delegates. And Virginia had a lot to do with this history of whiteness too, but this is a couple of centuries after the time I'll be talking about in this book. But this is when this ideology of white supremacy has been entrenched. What I'll be talking about was how it started. Okay, it didn't start in no science. It started in a room of white men who were shaping laws. The same type of white men like him, who and the elites, let's just say. Okay, he said in this Virginia House of Delegates, he said, "Sirs, we have so far as possible closed every avenue through which light may enter the slave's mind. If we could extinguish their capacity to see the light, then they would be out on the level of the beasts of the fields. Our work would be complete and we would be safe." This is fear of us knowing the truth of our history. Purpose of my show is to bring light to my people, to anybody who's interested in this history. And I use books like this to light your curiosity, okay? I can't tell you everything in my half-hour shows, okay? I try to do my best, but I hope I put a light, an interest in you so that you will go and seek these books. There's another book here I have. This is The History of Black America. It's got some information by the great scholar LaRon Bennett. used to be the historian for Ebony magazine. Many great historical knowledge came out of this brother, but some of the stuff that I'm be talking about too, you can find at the beginning of this book. He starts in this era of indentured servitude, and he talks about, like I showed in the first show, that some black men were freed, some were indentured, and then a lot were enslaved, and also Native Americans, white women, and Englishmen, and because there was a population boom in England in the early 1600s, and there was a need for gang labor in these tobacco farms. Okay, and if you want to know more, I start off with that information in show 1. So show 2 starts. This is where I left off. Okay, I ended talking about Bacon Rebellion and Nathaniel Bacon. Okay, this was a turning point from the time of when that separation from and the terminology of whiteness came in, because the powers that be got freaked out because of this thing. Nathaniel Bacon, who was a small town plantation owner, but he was at the bottom, and he saw that all around him he had other pissed off poor farmers, black and white. Okay, and he came together with them. Okay, so who were these people? Okay, I'll start off where I left off. They were European men who had served out their indentured and discovered that the land promised to them had already been swallowed up by the governor's cronies and the king's favorites. They were people whose tobacco prices had collapsed while their taxes rose. They were Africans. People didn't understand that there was this period of time when we were just as equal in our economics as white people at the time. Didn't last long, but for a couple of decades, it was the truth. Okay? They were Africans, some enslaved, some indentured, some free, who had equally nothing to gain from loyalty to the planters class. They were poor peoples of every origin with nothing left to lose, and they were armed. Bacon organized this multiracial force, European and African, indentured and enslaved and free, and led them first against the neighboring native tribe. There's always this, he was kind of racist in his own right, because he was one of the things that he was pissed off because he wanted to take and speculate the land that would belong to our native brothers and sisters, but the governor did not want that. Okay, that was the origin of it. Then it became a war against the second part of that war. It went on for about a year. It was against the rich, the elite at that time. Okay, and then against the British colonial establishment itself. There was a 2-part war. Okay, they marched on Jamestown, the capital of the colony, the famous David. They burnt it to the ground. Okay, the royal governor fled across the Chesapeake Bay. The rebellion held the countryside for more than a year. You weren't told how devastating this is to those white elites. Okay, let's go on to the next. In 1681, 5 years after the ashes of Jamestown had cooled, the Maryland this is when the changes started happening. The Maryland General Assembly passed a new law. On the surface, it appeared to be a revision of the 1664 marriage status. I talk about that in part 1. It prohibited British and other white women from marrying enslaved men. Okay, that's when the term white came into being, because of the fact that women were marrying enslaved men from the 1664. In 1681, they tightened that law up. Okay, read those 4 words again slowly. British and other white women. That's the first time in law. This is the moment. This is the birth. This is the first time in legal history of this land that the word white appears in any statutes as a name for a category of human being. Not British, not Christian, not European, white. Prior to that, that's the terminology that was used in all legal statutes. You were British, you were Portuguese, you were this, but it's 1681, the first law that says, and it had to do with black men marrying white women, that the term white came into being. A brand new word doing brand new work in the world. A word that did not exist in law the day before it was written, and that would exist in law forever after until this very day. Okay? It didn't come from no science lab, no research, no DNA sample. It was a legal term because British elites did not like the fact that white women were marrying. Now, the masses of people didn't care at the time. They had to be conditioned. It took them a couple of centuries, not a couple of decades, I should say. And then we started believing the hype after this generation died out and nobody knew that history, then it was automatic. You know, that's the power of laws. People don't realize how important a law is. Okay, we stop at red lights automatically today. Prior to the car, there was no such thing as red lights or stoplights or whatever like that. It took laws in the early 1900s that to deal with automobiles, and by generation after generation of following that law, you don't even think twice about stopping at a stoplight. You were conditioned to accept what something as a law. So that's another reason you got to realize how important who legislates the laws that you are supposed to follow, because it conditions generations of minds to follow it. And whether that law is based on racism, like what's going on right now in the United States with the redistricting, they condition generations, hundreds of years of generations of white people based on this one terminology of British and other white women. And all the laws came after that miscegenation separated. Let's go on to the next. Ask yourself the obvious question, the one no one in power wants you to ask. Did the Irish servant, the Scottish laborer, the Portuguese sailor, the Dutch farmer, did they undergo some physical transformation between 1680 and 1681 when that law was written in Virginia or Maryland? Did God reach down and rearrange their biology? Of course not. They were the same human beings the day after the law was signed as they had been the day before. What changed was their flesh. What changed was their name. A lawmaker dipped a pen in ink, and in one afternoon, he took people from a dozen different nations who had been at war with each other in Europe for centuries, I mean, most likely even thousands of years, I'll add, people who did not share language, religion, or custom, and he bound them together under one new word, white. He renamed them. He gave them a new identity, and that identity came with both a price and a benefit that would not become fully clear until it was too late to refuse the bargain. Okay, we're still dealing with that to this day. Let's go on. 10 years later, in 1691, Virginia followed with its own racial statute, I should say, using the same language, extending the same logic. And now you see how it's snowballing, okay? From Virginia and Maryland, the new legal category spread through the colonies in time across the new republic. And let no one tell you these laws were about morality. They read nothing like sermons. They are property laws. They are labor laws. They are political laws written by men who had just watched their world nearly burn down and intended to make sure it could not burn down again. Divide and conquer. Before Bacon the rebellion, he got black, white, native people who were under these indentured servitude conditions, who slept in the same room, who ate out of the same pot, who were whipped by the same overseer. This was going on prior to 1681, and who were overtaxed and lied to about the land they were going to get, because that's why they went into that contract of servitude. And these were pissed off united workers, when you unite workers and the power that be could not have, and they decided to start writing laws that would divide them. And the first thing they divide these workers with and these poor people with was the color of their skin, okay? Period. The birth of whiteness. Let's go on. One law does not make a world. The 1681 Maryland statute was the opening move in a long, deliberate game. In the decades that followed, colony after colony passed a cascade of racial laws, each one adding another beam to what historians today call the architecture of white supremacy. That's the birth of it. The pattern is unmistakable when you lay the statutes side by side. Each statute was a beam. Each statute, it was deliberately done. White supremacy, when you hear black people like myself say white supremacy, we are not talking in hyperbole. We are talking literal, by law. But you're taught that the United States was the land of the free, and the colonials came here for their freedom. Not these poor people who are indentured, which was the majority of what became white people came there. They came as indentured servants. They were treated just as horrible as the black indentured and the black enslaved persons. And they also rebelled, ran away from plantation alongside black people. But one thing about a white indentured servant going to another colony, he could blend in because he's white. If you're black, just like today, we can't wash this off. We're still condemned for the color of our skin. It started in 1681. There's a date, okay, a year that white supremacy as we know it, the seeds of it, the psychological adaptation of it started. You're not taught this, but you're taught here the Umoja Circle. Our purpose is to correct errors where errors are found and introduce facts where we find people working on fiction. What you've been taught about history is fiction. This is fact. Let's go on. These are some of the things that started happening, this white supremacy divide and conquer. And guess who they mess with? Black people, okay? Supreme Court take away the Voting Rights Acts. What are these MAGA Republican white supremacists are doing right now? Taking away our Voting Rights Act. Who are they messing with first? They're messing with us. They didn't do the same thing happened after that 1681, and all these colonies started taking a chapter out of it. They stripped free black men of the right to hold public office. Now, you're supposed to be free. They had rights to do that in previous decades prior to 1681. No longer. A man who could have stood for election in 1670 could not stand for election in 1710. Same man, same intelligence, same property, new laws. Black people could have voted between 1960 and 2026. Now they're diluted out of voting. What's the difference between now and then? They criminalized marriage. They criminalized marriage across the newly drawn color line. Families that existed, real families with children, were suddenly illegal families, okay? They armed poor white men upon completing their indentured. At the end of a European laborer's contract, the colony was required to give him goods. That was for even included blacks before 1681. Like I said in the first show, when I talked about Benjamin Madame's white grandmother, she was an indentured servant, okay? And when she finish her indentured, she was given land and properties. The black indentured servant who got it at that time, around this time, that wasn't happening for him. So you're seeing white supremacy being built. I'm white, I have these conditions. You're black, you don't have these rights. That's white supremacy. That's white privilege. All that started right now, from the beginning of this country. Okay, like I said, they armed poor white men upon completing their indentured. At the end of the European labor contract, the colony was required to give them goods, including guns and gunpowder. The message was clear: your freedom comes with firepower. They disarmed free black men by law. The same guns placed in the hands of poor white laborers were simultaneously, by the same pen stroke, taken from free black men. The contract was not accidental. It was the point. Since the Bacon Rebellion in 1676, where a combined multiracial army for a year held the colonial colony of Virginia in sway, freaked out the English overseers and the American colonial elites. And this is what they started to do to divide and conquer. And it has worked for hundreds of years. Let's go on to the next. They barred black people from testifying against white people in court by law. A white man could rob, beat, rape, or kill a black person, and every black witness to the act could not open their mouth in a courtroom. Black life was legally silenced. This is the legal foundation on which a century of unpunished violence was built. This is the foundation of white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan later on, and all these other types of white privileged and racial attacks on black. You know, this is why black towns, like I talked about a month ago when I talked about the Reconstruction era, were burnt down with impunity. Okay, Black Wall Street, all these that came from this origin story. All right, when you, as the people who became white, and you were given by law these rights with no ramification against you, and you come generation after generation after generation, there's a quote that I also like to use, and I think this is the appropriate time to use it. It was done by a psychologist, Dr. Nobles, and he said that the action of the original individual of a people, like right now, becomes the history of the next generation, their children. And that history passed on, and that ideology passed on from generation to generation to generation, becomes the culture of that people. It started with a pen, it started with a law, and the action that allowed, that's carried out following that law, becomes the tradition multiple generations later. So what that they understood, the first generation understood what was going on, but by the fifth, sixth, seventh generation into the future, it is customary that we are the ones that have the guns and you are not allowed to. If there was no history classes, I'm sure, given to the future generations of those white people that became the recipients of these laws. Okay, let's go on to the next. They reversed the presumptions of freedom. If you were black and the law now presumed you were enslaved, if you were white, the law presumed you were free. The burden of proof shifted, and in a world without reliable paperwork, a shifted burden of proof meant the difference between your life and your death, okay? Now, that's why if you don't vote and you've got to make sure you put the right people who are going to produce the predominant law that will benefit you. If not, other people's interests would put their interests into law. Voting has consequences, folks. We still haven't learned that lesson for some of us today after this history. Now stand back from that cascade and ask the question that colonial elites did not want anyone to ask. Did any of these laws improve the material life of the poor whites? Okay, that's the same trick that they're using today, MAGA folks. Did they give him land, a wage that could sustain a family, a school for his children, a way out of debt, a share of the harvest he produced with his own hands? Let's go on to the next. First, they created a new floor, okay? By placing the Africans and Native people beneath everyone else, the lawmakers manufactured a social bottom. The poor white laborer was not rising, but now there was someone beneath him. That is a different thing from rising, but for a man with no prospect, it can feel like comfort, a cold comfort, a cruel comfort, but comfort enough to keep him in line. Okay, we saw lines of people wearing "Make America Great Again" who did not benefit from all the lies that were told to them. Again, nothing new. I talked about it in Black Reconstruction prior. That's why I'm bringing up these topics. You got to understand how you're being manipulated, white America. Let's go on. Second, they traded symbols for substance. The colonial elite gave poor white workers not land, not wages, not school. They gave them symbols. The gun at the end of indenture. The right to testify in court against a black man. The small dignities denied their black neighbors. These symbols were cheap and cheap to distribute. Excuse me. Tongue-tied. A plantation owner loses nothing by calling his indentured servant white. He loses a great deal by paying him a living wage. Which do you think they're going to go with? Okay, they're going to go with just calling them white. You're white, so you got these laws, but nothing else. Let's go on to the next. The third, they forged loyalty across a class chasm that had no economic basis. The poor white laborer and the wealthy plantation lord did not share food, schools, futures, or interests of any practical kind. What they now shared was a word, and that word was made to feel like a kinship, so that when the poor white man looked up at the big house, he no longer saw the man who was stealing his labor, he saw a fellow white. And when he looked sideways at the black man sweating in the next field, he no longer saw a fellow worker, he saw a threat. That is the architecture. That is how the house was built, by being, statute by statute, in broad daylight by men whose names are on the laws. Let's go on to the next. No account of this history is complete without bringing W.E.B. Du Bois into the room, because Dr. Du Bois looked at exactly what we had been examining and gave it a name, so precise that we still using it nearly a century later. In his 1935 master, Black Reconstruction, which I talked about last month, Du Bois described what he called the public and psychological wages of whiteness. That's what they sold back then, and they sold it in the last election that caused MAGA to come into being. He argued that poor white workers in America was compensated in part in a currency that never appeared on any pay stub. He was paid in deference, in access to public parks, libraries, and government offices that were closed to his black neighbors. In the cautious tip of the hat from a stranger on the street, in the knowledge that he would never walk in the room and be presumed to be the lowest thing in it. I'm gonna leave it, stop it right here. I want you to understand that what was created back then was a caste system. You've seen it. I've done shows on it in the past. That's what I do here at the Umoja Circle. This is the history I teach. Okay, we have a caste system, and you wonder why people are constantly voting against their own interests, because they look sideways at the black people who are working just as hard as they are, but they see themselves as white. They still bought into this wage of whiteness. And I'm gonna leave it right here. There's more, but until the next time, I hope you got something out of this. I hope you understand why white privilege is not really white privilege. It is a con, and you're being conned today. So until next time, peace, hotep, bye-bye.